Water is a right not just only for humans. It belongs to all beings.
We expect to see significant additional saltwater intrusion that will impact our wells. So when we think about water supply planning, not only do we have to think about new resources for future growth and the forthcoming population, but we also need to think about recovering the capacity or the water supply that we already rely upon.
Florida, the peninsula of Florida, is what we call in geology a carbonate platform, and it's all the result of carbonate depositions, marine depositions, sometimes freshwater depositions, but it's all a geologic history of sea level rise over the last 150 some odd million years. So as you drill down, you're looking at sea level come and go and come and go and come and go over geologic time.
Most places in Florida, the underlying ground is very porous. It's limestone. It used to be a coral reef. Much of South Florida used to be underwater. It would have been an inland sea thousands and thousands of years ago. And so most of that material is very porous. You dig a hole, fills up with water.
If you run down US 1, either from downtown Miami going all the way down into Everglades National Park, there was a rock ridge that ran the entire length of the coastline. Going on the other side of the rock ridge, that was the Everglades. And the Everglades covers what is virtually all of Miami-Dade right now.
Historically, Biscayne Bay used to be fresh. It was called the Sweetwater because water levels, freshwater levels in the Everglades were so high that they would overtop the Atlantic coastal ridge and pour all fresh water into the bay, as well as come in from the groundwater flow underneath the ridge into the bay. And there's accounts of the Spanish settlers that came in, wouldn't even have to land in Miami. They would just come into Biscayne Bay, put their buckets over the side, fill it up with fresh water, and use it.
Miami is founded in 1896 with 300 people. Now that's really interesting because the largest, most populous county in the state of Florida is Miami-Dade, with close to 3 million residents, many, many more million tourists who come down here every year. And it started in 1896 with 300 residents. Flagler's Railroad came down here. They wanted to name Miami Flagler. Flagler said, no, name it after somebody else. And they named it after the Miami Indians, who inhabited the coast or the shoreline of Lake Okeechobee way back then.
There's 8 million people living in South Florida. Many of those 8 million people are living in areas that used to be natural and swamplands.
Obviously, this is a booming city. Anybody who lives in Miami and looks around, they see cranes and new construction everywhere. When I got here in the mid-90s, I kind of remember the Freedom Tower as the big structure in downtown Miami.
I'm Betty Osceola. I'm a member of the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida. You know, I was born and raised out here in the Everglades. My family has been here for many generations. And I I grew up in an Indian village not too far from here along the Tamiami Trail, and I still live in that Indian village to this day with my family. And so I always grew up experiencing the natural world around me. As a kid, you know, myself and my siblings, we'd go barefoot running around in the Everglades playing. Nature, you know, nature was our playground, and while being out there, we connected with the natural world. And the Everglades, actually, the headwaters of the Everglades started, you know, where Mickey Mouse is, up in Orlando, Kissimmee area. And, you know, when it rained, the rain went where it was designed to go because it had a wide area to go to. And Lake Okeechobee, when it got full, just like a puddle, when it gets full, it starts flowing out, so it flowed out around it.
With the development of South Florida, and people saw the Everglades as a big area that possibly could be used for agriculture. But unfortunately, the plants that we wanted to grow, their roots don't do well being flooded. So in an effort to drain the Everglades, people had come in and started digging canals. And the canals were dug from Lake Okeechobee south and also from the coastline inland, and then they met in the middle. And the canals were very good at draining off the surface water, but the canals are also dug directly into our limestone bedrock. So when the surface water drained away, the next thing to drain was the groundwater. So groundwater levels started to drop, and we think that groundwater levels dropped here in Dade County at least 3 feet from historical levels.
That river of grass that used to flow south of Lake Okeechobee was redirected through canals for flood control purposes and water supply purposes, and to create this large swath of land that is the Everglades agricultural area. So humans benefited from those changes, that replumbing. However, what folks did fail to see when South Florida was replumbed was that Mother Nature sends water where she knows it needs to go and how it needs to go. And so the human impacts from that replumbing, the negative impacts have outweighed in many, many cases the benefits from that initial replumbing.
The Central and South Florida flood control system that was built many years ago essentially created a series of dikes and canals to move the water. And those dikes and canals provide flood protection for the 8 million people that live here. They provide the ability to move water east and west and north and south. They also do a very good job of recharging the Biscayne Aquifer.
We depend on the Biscayne Aquifer for our water supply, which is part of the Everglades system and which is directly hydraulically connected to Biscayne Bay and the ocean. We currently produce about 310 million gallons a day of drinking water from that Biscayne Aquifer source.
We have a very porous and highly transmissive aquifer, the Biscayne Aquifer, that has served us very well in terms of a high quality water supply. But as a function of the drainage of our landscape and the manipulation of the water table, keeping it lower so that we don't flood because we have such low land elevations, and flood management is a challenge, we've artificially dropped the water table. As a result, that allows that seawater from the ocean can move inland.
We have well fields that we've placed over the years to provide water for people that kind of pull that salt towards it. If you don't keep the aquifer recharged, the salt water moves inland.
It usually happens when people are pulling water from wells and they happen to be close to the coast, and if you start seeing increases in salinity levels in those monitor wells, that tells you you might have a little bit of a problem.
One of the important things about South Florida is that aquifer of fresh water has to stay full to combat saltwater intrusion.
There are some things you can do. One is number one is conserve water so that you're not pulling as much water out of the groundwater system. The next is something that our agency can do to try to keep groundwater levels higher. Now that may seem a little counterintuitive, but by having freshwater levels higher from a regional perspective, that would limit the amount of salt water that could come in to the aquifer. Some of the well fields are very close to the coast where the salt water is. Over the last 10 or 20 years, some utilities have elected to install their well fields further to the west. Despite some of our best efforts and you know, with growth going on, those salinity levels continue to rise.
Fresh water has a salinity of 0, and you can drink it all the way up to a salinity of about 1. And anything higher than 1, you can start to taste it.
Probably over time, the greater threat to the Biscayne Aquifer will be sea level rise. And it's, you know, as everyone's aware of that sea level is rising, how fast it rises, you know, depends on who you talk to and what data you look at. But what we're doing here at Water and Sewer is we are looking at how is that going to impact our well fields, our wastewater disposal systems, basically our whole infrastructure for water and wastewater, and how do we engineer for that going forward into the future in a sustainable manner.
We have a series of primary canals that run east and west across Broward County, and those canals have what we call salinity control structures on them, and it separates fresh water in our canals from the salty water in the coastal environment. And we see that those salinity control structures, which are really designed to protect our aquifer, also do a very good job at helping to manage the landward extent to which the water tables fluctuate with sea level rise.
As sea level rises, the water levels in the Biscayne Aquifer, which is very shallow, will eventually rise along with sea level.
The more that our groundwater responds to rising seas, and it does because our aquifer is very transmissive, so what happens offshore ends up influencing our own water table. When that happens, it ends up that salt water pushing against the fresh water that would typically fill our aquifer, and it makes the aquifer then salty. Most people who live in the very low-lying areas of our community who have waterfront property would acknowledge that 20 years ago, too, they may have seen high tide flooding, but on occasion. You know, clearly the level of flooding that is happening today was not happening 20 to 25 years ago, or we would have designed our infrastructure differently.
Right now, everything's coming to a head, certainly encouraged by long-time practices, agricultural practices, stormwater treatment and management, or the lack thereof, the replumbing of South Florida. It's all been building up, and then you add in climate change, increased temperatures, crazy rainfall patterns. And South Florida has really gotten to a point of what seems a point of no return.
We're talking about the whole greater ecosystem of the Everglades. You know, we're not just talking about you know, that swampy part down 8th Street, you know, which is many people's misconception of what the Everglades actually is. You know, we're talking about that whole ecosystem, you know, from the headwaters of the Kissimmee You know, the pine rocklands, the hardwood hammocks, you know, the sawgrass prairies, the marl prairies, you know, the mangrove swamps. Places like this, you know, where the sea meets the fresh water and all the estuaries. We're talking about this whole system even down into the bay. Love the Everglades. We're an environmental advocacy group down here in South Florida. What we do, we advocate for the water, for the Everglades, Everglades education, native plants.
And the way that we do that has been through politics and policy work, making relationships with scientists so that we can get the best data and to educate ourselves. A lot of work with artists so that we can interpret our experiences through different media, as well as faith communities so that we can offer prayers for the different aspects of the circle of life.
When I was a kid, we hunted, we fished. My grandmother didn't eat food from the store, so we either grew it or, my brothers went out hunting, we went out fishing, we did what we could to find food. And that's just how we grew up. And then in the early 70s, they started saying there was too much mercury in the water, too much phosphorus. So since the 70s, we were told, the indigenous people, not to drink this water. And it's changed, our lifestyles where we're dependent on surviving and finding food. And, instead of not needing money, we've gone to a position where we need money to find ways. And people say, well, why don't you just live off the Everglades? I can't. You want me to make that conscious decision to poison my grandkids, from polluted water that I did not cause.
Ancestors would build villages on tree islands or in the forested areas of the Big Cypress, growing crops, following game animals, meeting up for ceremonies at a certain time of the year or to share knowledge or healing. So there was a really strong relationship with plants and animals and the elements of nature.
If you're familiar with wetlands, you know that they are the kidneys of the natural world. They take polluted water and they clean it, they treat it. And when it leaves the wetland, then it is cleaner and healthier and less polluted. And so we need to get that function back. If we have a canal that goes to a deep reservoir that goes to another canal, that doesn't work. There has to be the treatment of that water also. And so when we talk about regaining storage south of Lake Okeechobee, you can't separate that from the treatment that is necessary also. Right now, the Everglades agricultural area it has agriculture, it grows crops. I don't know about all of the crops, but I can tell you between 400,000 and 500,000 acres of that Everglades agricultural area is planted in sugarcane. All of that water that flowed slowly south from Lake Okeechobee was in effect being stored and treated on its way down to Florida Bay.
That water is loaded with all kinds of cattle waste. As it flows out to the east and west, it's picking up more agricultural waste from sugar fields, from tomato fields.
Water really is the life of the Everglades. It dictates how the Everglades survives, how it thrives, the flow of the water. These are things that have all been interrupted over the years and things we're trying to change now through Everglades restoration. But the quality of the water is also very important. There's huge concerns with the water coming through Okeechobee. A lot of these fertilizers, a lot of the sugar plantations, a lot of these agricultural areas that are putting tremendous amounts of fertilizers and phosphates into the water, causing things from algae blooms to suffocation of wildlife in the water itself. These are things that have tremendous domino effects. People don't see it because a lot of times it's underwater. And the human being, the average adult, is going to say, I don't see it, I don't recognize it. But you'll start recognizing it when things like water populations, like fish populations, start to change. When all of a sudden the snook population is down, or the bonefish population goes down because the water quality is changing, or you're getting high mercury levels in our game fish, and all of a sudden an industry that brings dollars to South Florida, the tourism industry, the fishing industry, is profoundly affected because this water quality is diminishing the amount of fish that are in an area, the quality of fish that are in an area. Then you're going to start recognizing that. And that's unfortunately when people really start to try to make a difference, is when it hits them in their pocketbook. People need to understand we need to address this now.
You got to look at the entire picture. And in order to get water to flow, you may have to reclaim some of those lands and put them back to the natural environment.
The Everglades really is a natural treasure here of South Florida. You know, at first glance, people might just see an endless savanna of reeds and sawgrass, but the reality is it's home to an incredible variety of wildlife.
One thing that we could all agree on is that we want clean water. You know, how can we make more people care? You know, how can we highlight the connections between the air we breathe and the water we drink?
You get somebody out into a beautiful place like this, and they start to understand and appreciate, and then when that place is threatened, they think, hey, I love that place, I want to protect it, I want to fight to protect it.
Our new motto now is to fight water with water. Let's fight sea level rise and saltwater intrusion with fresh water from the mainland. Let's allow more water to come down from Lake Okeechobee through the central Everglades and into Everglades National Park and have it push out towards the bays and the seas in an effort to stem back that tide, that rising tide of sea level.
As we drill here, as you get to see this whole sequence of changing climates and changing sea levels through the geologic history, and I think it puts it in perspective. We have, you know, cities with millions of people living right at sea level rise, whereas 10,000 years ago, it's a whole lot easier to move a small village away from the coastline than it is to move a city of Miami away from a coastline.
Some cities may have that plan where we're going to relocate and further in. You can only relocate so far. So if you relocate further in and you start building in, you're adding to the problem, the very problem that got us here.
It's an engineering feat. Create, again, a new river of grass to the extent possible. It is an engineering feat. It's certainly, it has to be based on science. It is a public pressure feat. It will never, ever happen unless the people of South Florida, the people who love the Everglades, the people who love natural Florida, the people who understand that sea level rise in South Florida is mitigated by returning a southern flow. For all of those people have to get involved. And so engineering, science, public pressure, and then of course it's a political question. And so you throw all of that into a bag and you shake it up, and it's a crazy mess, but it can work.
We are a part of the natural world. Everything needs water. Nature needs to have a voice at the table. And that's how we're going to come to these solutions.